We're a superpower and we're going to conduct ourselves as a superpower. That's a quote from Stephen Miller, Donald Trump's Deputy Chief of Staff from this week. And Donald Trump himself said this also this week. I don't need international law. The only thing that can stop me is my own morality, my own mind. Welcome to 2026, everyone. It felt hard to keep up with headlines from the US this week, from the military operation in Venezuela to the threat to seize Greenland to ICE agents shooting and killing a protester. So in true European style, we'll try and take a step back and give you a full Berlin briefing today where we ask Germany's relative silence in the face of rowdy US conduct. How much of that is helplessness and how much is strategy? And I've got two great guests, familiar faces. Here with me is Thorsten Benner. You're a think tanker and you founded the Global Public Policy Institute here in Berlin. I'm very much looking forward to your insights here. Everybody follow Thorsten also on X. Some very spicy remarks there. And Michaela Küfner is here with us as well in Munich in a hotel. Michaela, let's start with you. Have you ever seen a start to a year quite like this in terms of transatlantic relations?
No, I've never actually seen a beginning of the year like this at all. I think it matches probably 2022, when in February we saw Russian aggression against Ukraine, the US now going after a rules-based international order within the first couple of days. Never seen anything like this before.
What about you, Thorsten?
No, but I think it's the new normal with Donald Trump as our pacing challenge.
All right, so I think we should all get on the same page and do a brief sum up. What did the US, what did the Trump administration do this week? So they went ahead and attacked Venezuela. They attacked the capital, Caracas, and then seized the leader, Nicolas Maduro, and his wife, brought them to the US. They publicly justified that move with access to oil and not with an attempt to hold early elections in Venezuela. The US also seized oil tankers. One was under the Russian flag. The US raised its defense budget for 2027 by $500 billion. The US also withdrew from 66 international organizations and commissions, and the US specified its threats to seize Greenland, which is, of course, an independent part of Denmark, so a NATO ally, with a range of options on the table, including a use of the US military. Thorsten, let's start with you. What is the most astounding headline from the US this week for you?
I mean, it's quite telling. The president gave an interview to the New York Times and he says, I'm not constrained by the US Constitution. I'm not constrained by international law. My only barriers and constraints is my own morality. And I'm not meaning to hurt anybody, he said, in true mafia boss style. So that's what we're confronted with, a president who sees himself as a very unconstrained actor who exercises US power just as he pleases. And we need to find an answer to that, which isn't easy if we're easily blackmailable because we're dependent on the US for our security. On your question, I would say it's a tactic that we're downplaying the violation of international law. It's a tactic out of helplessness because we're vulnerable. We're easily blackmailable by the US. But I do think we need to revisit this overall strategy that NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has pioneered. Submit to Donald Trump in the hope that you can then kind of calm the waters as best as possible.
Okay, that's an interesting thought, and we'll get into the discussion about that. But Michaela, I want to talk to you about the German reaction. It took a long time the US attacked Caracas on Friday night, and it took until Saturday afternoon for the German government actually to comment. Let's look at that tweet that Friedrich Merz then put out. So the German Chancellor said the legal assessment of the US intervention is complex and requires careful consideration. International law remains the guiding framework. At this stage, political instability in Venezuela must be avoided. The objective is an orderly transition to an elected government. This is a post on X by the German Chancellor in response to the US essentially abducting the leader of a neighboring country. Michaela, walk us through that German response. What must have been going on in Friedrich Merz's office then?
Well, clearly it took a long time to come up with the whole complex phrase. Then we saw a later statement by Kaja Kallas from the European Union and European leaders uniting behind that, with the exception of Hungary, of course. In the end, Friedrich Merz left it just a few days ago now to his spokesman, and that was only after the UN Security Council meeting, which decided that it was not according to international law, because of course China and Russia sit in there, who have their own vested interests in Venezuela. That's when he let his own spokesman speak about this being contradicting international law. But I still doubt whether you're going to hear that out of the mouth of the German Chancellor, because he realized pretty early on that the international rule book has been dropped by Donald Trump, and the United States was the only country which effectively guaranteed that these rules ever came into being and had to be applied and became a reference point post the Second World War. So with the guarantor of this very international rules-based order having dropped the rules altogether, and I think the New York Times interview is only the final proof that that is what has happened across the board, that there will no longer even be any pretense to stick to any of these rules, that the US is not even trying to argue along those lines, not even trying to twist the argument there at all. That leads to Friedrich Merz being very pragmatic. And the first evidence of that actually was when the US launched a missile attack against the Iranian nuclear program, when pretty much up until the last moment, we saw pledges from the German foreign minister to defuse the situation, not to launch into anything. And then after that attack, we didn't see Friedrich Merz comment on legality or anything. He just moved on. He just spoke of new opportunities in the Middle East. So clearly he's willing to accept that this is the reality, and he's willing to accept that who's right according to international law simply doesn't matter in reality anymore. That's the reality we live in.
But they're still not saying that out loud. Let's just listen to what Merz's spokesperson said this week, addressing journalists, when it came to assessing the picture that the United Nations Security Council established after hearing the US's justification.
The discussion of this issue in the UN Security Council the night before last was a very important step for the German government as well. We noted that the UN Security Council did not reach a common assessment on the classification under international law. In any case, the US did not convincingly demonstrate that its actions were in accordance with international law.
So, Thorsten, we heard Merz's spokesperson say the US did not convincingly tell other members of the United Nations Security Council that this was international law in application. What is the German position on the attack in Venezuela?
I think the German position is what the Chancellor says. Nobody's claiming that it is in accordance with international law, although nobody's shedding any tears over Maduro's ouster. He was a brutal dictator, and I think very few in Germany really regret that move. But I think nobody in government really claims that this is in accordance with international law. But the interesting thing is, they've, I think, understandably assessed that it's not necessarily in the German national interest right now to be particularly loud and outspoken about this. And I can empathize with this, given the vulnerabilities we've discussed vis-a-vis the US. But I think one conclusion, all those who have always scolded India, for example, for not speaking out loudly enough against Russia's aggression against Ukraine, and the Chancellor is traveling to India in just a few days. Kaja Kallas always scolded India and so on. Now she has to eat her own words because she doesn't get the mandate, or she doesn't even think it's in the European interest to be particularly loud and outspoken about the blatant violation of international law by a key European ally who guarantees for our security right now. So I understand the conclusion, and the other conclusion, though, needs to be we need to invest full force, and that's whenever any decision maker in Europe gets up in the morning, they should think about how can we get independent in terms of being able to secure our own defense in Europe, so that in the future we're not so easily blackmailable.
Michaela, this is something, of course, what Thorsten is pointing out here, that is making the German argument a lot weaker, that international law must always apply if they're not prepared to call violations against it out if they are being committed by the big brother, the United States.
Look, there's a lot of talk of Zeitenwende, and we just heard the German president, who can talk very freely and easily because he's not involved in day-to-day politics. We heard him speak about another Zeitenwende again, and this really means that the rules no longer apply. And the big decision that Friedrich Merz has to make, and that the Europeans actually now have to make, is whether they will settle on being the ones who are right, according to the book, but have no leverage. And without leverage, being right is not enough. That's a very painful lesson that the Europeans and the Germans are learning at this moment in time. And that's also why we see Friedrich Merz insist so much that economic strength, because that's the only leverage that Germany can roll out fast, if it applies the right tools here in Germany, because the figures aren't looking that great. But that's why he wrote a letter to all MPs, basically pleading with them to play ball, to move along with reforms in order to strengthen the German economy. It's still the third largest economy in the world. It doesn't look like it can maintain that for that terribly much longer, unless German businesses and the economy gets back on its feet here domestically. At the same time, Germans are privately saving money at record amounts. Some 30 trillion are being saved up. So there is potential in Germany, but there's also a lot of fear to move. And that's a dynamic that Friedrich Merz has to unleash in order for Germany to maintain a leverage to talk business with Donald Trump, because clearly he sees global politics more as a business enterprise than anything else.
You've just already mentioned the German president and his words on that double change of times, the doppelte Epochenwende, as he called it. Let's just listen to what Frank-Walter Steinmeier said, and then we'll discuss some more.
What we are witnessing is, in my view, something like a double historical rupture. Of course, the first part of this double rupture is Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea in violation of international law, and then the full-scale invasion of Ukrainian territory. But there is quite clearly a rupture of values by our most important partner, the United States, a partner that helped building the very order I have just described, and for decades shaped it in a decisive way. In my view, we have moved well beyond the stage of merely lamenting a lack of respect for international law, or the erosion of the international order. Today, the task is to prevent the world from turning into a den of thieves, where the most ruthless simply take whatever they want.
Thorsten.
Yeah, we're running out of Zeitenwendes in our discussion a little bit, but I think evidently the president is right. Although U.S. taking exceptions and exemptions from international law is nothing new. I mean, they did it in Iraq. The difference back then was very easy for the German chancellor at the time to really go all in against this, even win an election on the opposition against the U.S., because he didn't need to fear that George W. Bush would withdraw protection from Germany for that. So we're indeed in a new situation. And plus, at the time with Iraq, at least the U.S. made a sort of an international law argument on why they had the right to go in. Right now, you can accuse Donald Trump of a lot of things, but not of hypocrisy, because he just says, I'm there for the oil and for the dominance. And he has some pretense of drugs, but it's basically the oil and achieving or demonstrating American dominance. So we're in this world, and it's not just Donald Trump. I thought it was quite telling that quite a few European commentators asked then, what do we say if Putin and Xi do the same? Mm-hmm. And that almost implies that, first of all, what we say matters, and second of all, that
you don't believe it does.
That Putin and Xi would be constrained by international law before and now no longer. I mean, they will want to take what they think is theirs, and Putin has demonstrated that he tries to with Ukraine. He cannot fully get it, and Xi will also not hesitate. And our question is not what do we say, but what can we do, or what leverage do we have? And coming back to Michaela's point, what military and economic deterrence can we muster in order to deter Putin, Xi, and ultimately also Donald Trump from running roughshod over our core interests?
Okay, so you're essentially stressing the point of pragmatism. We just need to get real about what's going on.
Well, we
right?
live in a world where three major powers just operate according to might is right. And then you can say, we uphold international law. That's the only thing we worry about. I mean, I do worry about it and the erosion and so on. But we also mostly need to worry about, and we can only ultimately have a fighting chance in order to uphold the international law and standards that we hold dear, if we actually bring to bear the leverage, the power, the military and economic, in order to work toward that direction. It's not with words that we will protect international law, as important as words are.
Yeah, Michaela.
I just want to jump in there because I define it, and some other analysts are as well. It's more like 2.5 international powers, because it's the US, it's China, and Russia, which is so highly dependent on China as well. Russia, which would struggle to really enforce anything outside of its close parameter, as we're seeing in Venezuela right now. It's the Russian air defenses that failed to fend off the Americans going in there. Although, of course, we don't want to go down the road of conspiracy theory, but we don't know exactly what was behind it. And the other thing is that, it's not particularly new. I mean, of course, it was a surprise that this attack on Venezuela actually then took place, and the Germans weren't informed, the Europeans weren't, and nobody really was, as far as we know. At the same time, Friedrich Merz told a German newspaper months ago here that his assessment is that the international rules-based world order is effectively suspended. So this is knowledge amongst those who hold power here in Europe. The question is, what do they do with it? Because it means surrendering a system that has served the Europeans pretty well in the past with the protection of the United States. Does that mean the Europeans give up their own rules-based order? Is this the wild, wild west now as we enter the phase of complete realpolitik? And at the same time, there's a recognition that they have to build up their own leverage. The only thing the Europeans have at the moment, because they don't have meaningful defenses, and is economic power and a warm sentiment for Europe still by Donald Trump. And I thought it was rather telling that it was the Brits, they're not part of the European Union anymore, but geographically they will always still stay Europe, help the Americans board those Russian-flagged ships. We've now seen recognition by Russia that at least one of them has a Russian crew on board, that being a partner to the United States is seen as the ticket to having a safe place in this future world order. And to some degree, we're also thrown back to who are the nuclear powers in the world. And in Europe, that is Britain and France. And it's not the Germans, whose nuclear defense would hinge on the Americans. So it's force. The Europeans are nowhere near becoming independent there, being able to defend themselves. And it's the economy, and that's the baseline. And that's also the language that the US president speaks.
And of course, all of this has a lot to do with the future of NATO. And let's just listen to the German reaction to the US threats when it came to all options on the table in terms of acquiring Greenland.
I can only say that Greenland, like the Faroe Islands, is part of the Danish kingdom. And since Denmark belongs to NATO, Greenland will, in principle, also be defended by NATO. If there are further requirements to strengthen defence efforts with regards to Greenland, then we will have to discuss this within the framework of the alliance.
So this was, of course, German Foreign Minister Johann Wadephul reacting to Donald Trump, saying we need Greenland from a national security point of view. Thorsten, Johann Wadephul stressed that Greenland is a part of Denmark, hence NATO. He also didn't condemn US threats to seize it by force, yet he joined other foreign ministers in issuing a public statement saying we will stand by Greenland, and why don't we all essentially work together more to enhance security in the Arctic. Can you just give us the context of this specific German position when it comes to Greenland?
I think the Greenland position is fairly outspoken. The Chancellor signed a joint statement with Macron, with the Danish Prime Minister, that was very, very clear on Greenland. And I'm a big fan of taking these threats in terms of wanting Greenland as the next trophy on the part of Trump and his acolytes very seriously, but also not overreacting at this stage in the sense of let's use the means that are most conducive and most efficient toward achieving that goal. And I personally don't think we should now, we have very few troops available. We hardly fill our brigade in Lithuania, and people who now say, oh, let's move troops to Greenland, I think they're a little bit out of their mind as deterrents, or let's throw out, or let's threaten the US closing their important bases here in like Germany. I think we have a really good chance to work through the American political system, because Donald Trump thinks he's unconstrained. But he's actually quite constrained. His power is decreasing overall domestically in the US as he's becoming a lame duck, as his MAGA alliance is fracturing. And on Greenland, you've seen it has been very effective on the part of Denmark and others, working with allies in Congress. There have been multiple statements by Republican, Democratic leaders that, you know, these threats against Greenland are not the way to go. And plus, I think the Gavin Newsom strategy of making fun of Trump is also not the most ineffective in terms of this. Because I think a very successful strategy against Trump on Greenland would be to ridicule his dreams of being the husky emperor of Greenland, while people in the US have a hard time paying for their daily expenses. And I think there you can hurt him, and you don't even need to go all in terms of deterrence and so on. All these empty threats, Europeans, or like until now empty threats. But I think we have a real chance. And we need to prepare. I don't think the first move by the US will actually be some sort of military escalation with Denmark, but they will still want to take it by, getting Denmark to surrender or to pay off Greenlanders in some sort of referendum. Elon Musk pays every Greenlander $1 million. He can easily do that, and for them to vote that they want to be in some sort of union with the US. And at the same time, we need to debunk these ridiculous arguments by Trump that he cannot meet his security needs. He has all the leverage with Denmark, with existing treaties, to place as many troops as he wants on Denmark. And American companies can also exploit Denmark's natural resources. So far, they haven't been particularly interested. But there's no constraints on the US. And all these economic and security arguments, I find, they don't hold much water. And we need to make those arguments also in the American public discussion.
And Michaela, is that something that you also hear when you talk to people who work with Friedrich Merz, that this is something where Germany is actually quite relaxed, that it is not going to come to a situation that the Greenland question specifically is more one where we should be not quite as excited and that it is one where there's a lot of noise and potentially less substance, as Thorsten just laid out?
Well, most of all, there's a recognition that the options are limited. Trying to push that back with words, that's already happened in that statement. It's important to know that the United States only have a couple of hundred troops currently stationed in Greenland. It's a NATO partner, it's a strategic partner, and that the US could station pretty much as many troops as they want, because that's what the Greenland is and what Denmark is openly saying. Look, come here, make this more safe. You don't need to take us over. We've been hosting you in the past. In fact, we wanted more US troops here than you were willing to station here. So that's the reality. And nobody's relaxed, but there's also a recognition that nobody will be able to defend Greenland, because that was the role the United States were supposed to have within NATO. We saw the Danish Prime Minister say that NATO is dead if the US were to go in. You're not going to catch anybody else say that, and particularly not Baltic countries saying anything along those lines, because there is a huge fear that indeed NATO could be further fractured than it already is. And that is the lifeline for the Europeans not to be exposed to the Russians, even more potentially also the Chinese. We're already part of hybrid warfare there. So options are limited. At the same time, we know that because Donald Trump said it himself, he was watching the attack on Venezuela, and he said it himself, like a TV show from Mar-a-Lago, probably with a couple of snacks. So he is someone who engages in business, but he also sees international politics clearly as a good TV show, and he wants to be the hero of that. That's why belittling any kind of attempt to want to intervene or seize effectively Greenland could be much more effective than quoting and re-quoting international law to US president, who says, l'état c'est moi. He does not, he's the international state order. He's not going to look at the small print of international law anyway. And that's a clear recognition here in Germany. And that's the walk on eggshells that Friedrich Merz, like all other leaders who still aim to maintain, or let me put it this way, revive the international rules-based order once this administration comes to an end.
So I would like you to essentially give me your thoughts. If this was a TV soap opera, this is a cynical thought now, okay? But if this was a TV soap opera, how could the Europeans make sure that Donald Trump would be watching it with interest? If the Europeans wanted him to watch a soap opera that has their own interests at heart, what would the next steps be? What would be in that script for the next episode, Thorsten?
I wouldn't worry so much. I mean, Donald Trump creates his own. He only likes TV shows where he's the central person, and not TV shows that are scripted by others. we need to become better masters of our own destiny. And we haven't discussed that we're not alone in the world. We have a lot of like-minded partners around the world who don't think that might is right, who want to invest in...
Who are you thinking about now?
I mean, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's Japan, it's many countries. I mean, look at Brazil, for example, or Mexico and
does that need to be more formalized, are you saying?
No, I think we shouldn't waste time on formalizing this, but on investing. And the chancellor is going and spending 3 days in India early next week is a sign we're doing this. Same with Brazil and other important partners. So we're doing this. We should cherish this. This is an important element of agency in this. And for the rest, do what I wouldn't worry so much how we can entertain, but more how we can impress Donald Trump. And I think we can impress him. If we tomorrow presented a plan to the Americans and say, these are the critical capabilities you right now give us in Europe in order to defend ourselves. Air-to-air refueling, lift, command and control, intelligence, and so on. And here's a clear transition plan. And by year X, month X, and so on, we want to take this over from you because this is what you have demanded. Why don't we do this? The NATO Secretary General is afraid of, if we do this, then the Americans will withdraw things. I mean, the people in the Pentagon who
will
planning,
give them ideas.
Exactly, and that's totally foolish because the people in the Pentagon who are doing the defense posture review right now, they've already decided they will reduce U.S. presence in Europe, and rightly so, because they need it for more credible deterrence in other theaters, mostly in the Indo-Pacific. And so why don't we develop this agency? And we should have done this a year ago. Clear transition plan on when do we want to assume responsibility for our own defense. And instead, we've kind of done half-hearted jobs on this. We've never stated it publicly. There's no clear plan.
And it's not a new idea.
Exactly.
It's not a new idea. And I remember talking to the German defense minister about it last year at the Munich Security Conference.
Pistorius wanted to do it.
Pistorius wanted to do it.
And Rothe didn't want it. And also some Americans said they don't want this. But don't be impressed. There'll always be some Americans who say, oh, maybe it's not the time for this now. Put this thing on the table and then act accordingly and spend our defense euros efficiently in Europe, working together with our partners, much rather than having 10 different defense industries and hundreds of different military systems. It's so simple, the answer, and it's so clear now again that we will be susceptible to blackmail and extortion as long as we can't guarantee our own security. So let's move toward that. It's so simple, and that should be top of mind of the discussion on all the threats by Trump to this mythical rules-based international order that Indians and Brazilians and so on have never believed in to begin with. They talk about international law, but not about the rules-based international order, which was always a sort of convenient creation by the West.
And that is a very pragmatic approach, how to counter essentially those threats, how to develop more agency, as you said, when it comes to the military threats to seize Greenland, etc. Of course, we would have to do another episode, and I'm sure that
on China,
on China.
Have me back on
how
that.
to do that. We'll have you back on that, and also we'll have to do an episode on how to counter the threats coming from the US in terms of the democratic system as such, not just the interaction between states, but also the way that the US is rebuilding it.
That's true, but it's a nuisance. But we're winning or losing our democratic system here. It's our agency. There we have a lot of agency.
That's right.
The AfD will not come to power because of Donald Trump, but because our elites fail to actually muster a convincing response.
Michaela, final thoughts.
My final thought is this is all very simple until you actually need a majority in the German parliament, for instance, or in regional parliaments. I've spoken to regional top candidates facing regional elections here in Germany, and this is a very, very hard sell to a German public who still expect Merkel-style stability in this world that is filling them with more and more fear. So taking responsibility also means to step up and break that bad news that the Europeans are on their own, that Germany is on their own, and that this will mean sacrifice. And we're speaking about this against the backdrop of there just having been an increase in pensions here in Germany. The spending is going into consumptive spending. There still is this lingering fear amongst politicians, all the way up to Friedrich Merz, to actually face the public and address the public straight on. It's different in the Baltics. There's a different level of awareness, but that still needs to be created. And the Europeans, the Germans, never suffered from a lack of analysis. I just want to do a quick detour. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, the former defense minister, in 2020 put a proposal on the table that the Europeans should seek a trade agreement with the Americans, even if it's against them, to their own disadvantage, in order to tie the United States strategically closer to Europe. That would have been a TTIP that doesn't really work economically for the Europeans. It was on the table. Nobody was interested in it, but just imagine Donald Trump. Yeah, just imagine Donald Trump was now economically tied to the Europeans a lot more. We would be strategically in a very different situation. So it's never been a lack of analysis. It's taking people, ordinary people along the way who are interested in jobs.
Yeah, and I can see that Thorsten wants to react.
No, because I think it would have made sense to do TTIP at the time, but I mean, look at how Trump has ripped up his own agreement with Mexico and Canada that he did. He sold it as the best agreement at the time. Now he has ripped it up, and nothing would have locked Donald Trump in terms of the trade relations with Europe. He would have looked at this TTIP and said, like, "Oh, this is a Biden thing," or whatever, or a thing I did in my first.
Let's renegotiate. But anyway, there would have potentially been some pushback from US companies, corporate America, who is notably silent on Donald Trump completely. And that would have been some leverage. Now the Europeans have very little leverage in the US.
Yeah, and to be very, very honest, of course, the Europeans know that they need Donald Trump when it comes to supporting Ukraine. And I think that brings us to the end of this episode, and we'll continue the conversation gladly online with you out there as well. Thanks very much for watching and listening wherever you found us. Leave us a comment and make sure that you subscribe also to our DW Berlin Briefing newsletter that comes out once a week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
And to Michaela, and until next time.